Hello, and welcome to Stories from the Wire, the AppNeta podcast, where we talk to the experts about the most pressing app and network issues facing the enterprise today and tell you how to work smarter, not harder, to speed up resolution. I'm Paul Davenport, AppNeta's resident tech journalist, and each week we're going to dive into a specific issue that we've helped an IT team tackle. Today, and over the coming weeks, we're diving right on into work from home, perhaps the hot topic of the past year, and how enterprises are optimizing their infrastructure to support a work from anywhere future. Spending is up in all areas of IT, however, and our guests today are going to discuss how teams should be prioritizing the spend and getting the biggest bang for their company's buck. With that, welcome to the show, returning champion Alec Pinkham, and making his Stories from the Wire debut, our Director of Solutions Consulting, Seth Differ.
Thanks, Paul. Looking forward to it.
Hey, Paul. Hey, Alec. Thanks for having me today.
Okay, so according to the latest estimates from Gartner, businesses are exiting survival mode and diving straight into growth mode, as worldwide IT spending will increase by 9% in 2021 to $4.2 trillion.
All right, 4.2. So I'm guessing they elaborated here. Did they talk about the core areas here, or did they just say one big number?
Oh, they split it up. We got data center systems, enterprise software, devices, IT services, and communication services. These are all the IT arenas that will see investment grow as enterprises map out their long-term prospects for a post-pandemic world, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, and I know across our customer base, we've seen big increases in the budget allocated towards that sort of large IT services bucket. And I think in particular, to me, that shows that many leaders are seeing the benefits and the business outcomes of those technology investments they made over the past year. And I think a lot of them are going to support a more agile or digitally oriented organization, as well as obviously a more remote one than we've had before.
Exactly. Yeah. And another big lift is infrastructure as a service spending that supports mission critical workloads while avoiding high on-premise costs. This puts IT services as the third fastest growing segment in Gartner's forecast. Businesses are set to spend $1.2 trillion alone in 2021, which is an increase of almost 10%. All right. So for starters, what's your take on seeing all of these figures? Investment is up almost 10% in nearly all IT categories. Is this really investing in the future, or is this a lot of remedying past mistakes, or is it both?
I think this is a little bit of both, but really for the 1 year increase, we saw last year that teams were really thinking about status quo. The users were sent home. Everyone started working from home. There wasn't a huge initiative to move forward and grow the business. It was just maintain what we had the previous years. I think the reason for the big increase in percentage of growth this year is they now understand that the businesses can run remotely, and they understand the infrastructure and the tools that users have, but that is inhibiting growth. And they want to find tools that are going to promote growth across the companies and lead back to that growth that they were experiencing pre-2020. So now they're investing in other infrastructure for users working from home. Contact center agents may not have a laptop or a desktop, but they might have a thin client. So they're having to shift what that infrastructure looks like. And then even smaller companies like us, for example, moving to cloud-hosted voice over IP solution versus an old on-prem solution. There's new growth in those regards as well.
Yeah, it summed it up really well. On a customer call recently, someone said, no roadmap survived 2020. And I think that's pretty true, right? Everything that was on a 3 to 5 year roadmap probably got destroyed a little bit. But I think what we're seeing also, as Seth mentioned, is we're seeing those projects almost run as a pilot in 2020 that are now leading to larger transformations. So I think that 10% figure could be an indication that companies are starting to take this seriously and thinking about this as an inflection point to really make some changes in core infrastructure or just the way that users connect.
Gotcha. So it's not universally putting a Band-Aid on things at this point. It's taking what worked when we were kind of testing out new things during the pandemic and now making them operational on the long term.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was, taking last year to learn, reevaluate what's going to work for the business and build a plan for that. And now we're seeing that accelerated plan come to fruition.
Where have companies invested in the past where the payoff hasn't been worth it, whether that's because of poor follow through, bad forecasting, or even a global pandemic?
My answer might, initially fall under the bad forecasting or poor follow through, but I think what I've seen and heard from the IT teams is more of an accelerated cloud movement. So prior to last year, for the previous 5 years, it seems like every year a study would come out and it was always, everyone's moving to the cloud, and it just kind of felt like it was stuck for a while. And last year, we had to move to the cloud because for various reasons, obviously, maybe some users couldn't connect back to on-prem services, or they were just having problems, or it was just easier with users working from home and not knowing what their home connection status might look like and getting them quicker, more quickly connected to their cloud applications, the teams had to move to the cloud. So accelerated cloud movement, I think, is number one thing I've recognized coming out of the pandemic.
I do think for the short term, there were a lot of companies that probably didn't see the investment paying off for SD-WAN. Anyone who had kind of done physical hardware between offices and things like that, with everyone working from home, a lot of SD-WAN vendors weren't set up for virtual or weren't set up for the purposes of a remote environment. So I think that's where you see a lot of them start talking about security, maybe shifting a little bit CASB side. But I think those will pay off in the future. The office is not going away entirely. There will be a use case for that. There will be a lot more remote than there was. But at the same time, I think short term, anyone who just finished an SD-WAN rollout before 2020 was probably kicking themselves a little bit.
Well, over the last 3 months, we've seen, just in our conversations, it's almost like the spigot turned back on. The SD-WAN conversation is back to being first and foremost. When we're running demos and we're starting to POC and trial with customers, and CASB services SASE solutions really have been there all throughout. But it's interesting that the hockey stick over the last 3 months that we've seen with the SD-WAN conversations coming back into play. So.
Yeah, I do feel like there was a really clear delineation of people talking about SD-WAN, then people talking about CASB kind of in concert, and then immediately shifting towards service edge and starting to think about, okay, so now can we do all that security stuff and routing stuff from the edge because we need to? So that certainly felt like a pretty clear line in the sand. And I think, as you mentioned, it's all coming back. All are relevant. All have their place, and I think all are pretty good investments. The question is, what do you need now, based on how much of your workforce is going to be remote versus how much is going back to the office, or what that hybrid world looks like.
So infrastructure as a service was mentioned by Gartner in the data as a big growth area. Can you discuss what this concept means, from your perspective at least, why it's so popular now, and why this is good or bad or both for IT?
It's interesting topic. Over the last few weeks, I've had conversations with some senior level execs around this idea specifically. And really what they're looking for is they're expanding their tool sets. They're moving to cloud services, AWS, Azure, IBM. They're using SaaS applications. They're using us to gain some metrics on their work from home agents and their end-to-end insights. They also have SNMP polling still going on for some of their locations. And so their tool sets are expanding, and they're looking for a more singular way to have visibility across those tools. And whether that's integration through APIs, or we can feed data into another solution that can either visualize that or aggregate their alerting notifications, so they just have a more centralized platform. I think ultimately it's going to help the IT teams gain more integrated insight. But in the short term, it means there's going to be a steep curve for these teams to understand how they're going to roll that out. There's a number of companies out there that help do it, a number of open source or languages that do it. So there's a bit of a learning curve there. And what exactly do they want to pull into these systems? So long term, it'll help them pay off to save some time and money. But short term, it's not something that the teams are have fully done completed in the past. So there's going to be a curve there. So.
I think the other thing you'll note from infrastructure as a service is that it's kind of the closest to metal option for anyone doing a lift and shift or moving legacy apps to the cloud to allow them to be better accessible outside of the office. So I think one thing that we're going to see is that as you move apps to the cloud, the greater understanding of needing to microservice out the architecture, or as Seth mentioned, use those APIs, I think that's going to be a huge part of it. And so re-architecting some of these services, if you're not replacing them, but you still need to use them, is going to be that next phase, in which case you might see a shift towards leveraging, SaaS or even PaaS type services instead of straight infrastructure. But I think as a first step, that's obviously a good one when moving an application that's run, happily in a data center. It's a way to do it all at once without having to re-architect, but that does have a limited runway as far as how long you're going to use that before you're going to need some re-architecture to take advantage of either new features or take advantage of potentially better data storage options that the cloud offers.
All right. So the $1 million question, where do you think IT spend will go next year? 2 years from now, 5 years from now? What are our pie in the sky goals here?
I think in the short term, it's going to be more around refining the policies that have been created over the last year or so. People are working from home. They're hiring people from home who have never even been to an office before. So they're having to send gear out, but they're creating policies around what works best for their users, for their department specifically. What machine is that? What headgear are we sending them? Things like that. So more short term there, but the longer term, I feel like, as people continue to work from home, the CASB, SASE solutions, SD-WAN will be integrated into that. We'll still hear those terms in the mid 3 to 5 year range. And obviously, we had mentioned earlier the expedited shift to cloud services. I feel like that's going to be something that we'll see for 6 years running, probably, but shift to the cloud and actual shift to the cloud versus just talking about it. So.
I think this is totally a prove it year, right? This is a larger increase than we've seen in previous years. And I think it's a direct relation to technology changes and tests that people did over the past year. So I think it's IT's prerogative to basically say, we're going to take this money, we're going to make some technology changes that are going to help the business. It's going to be on them to prove it and make sure that they understand, how that has affected the business, how it's positively or negatively affected. And I think that change and also that kind of business mindset, if done correctly, means that next year they get to keep that budget and get to do some more transformations. I think without that, you're going to see this return to a lower level, but this is an inflection point. Everyone would agree the pandemic is a huge inflection point when it comes to business, how we work. It can also be an inflection point of how much we put into technology and how much we put in IT to make sure not only the end user experience is good for the apps that are critical to business, but also that IT can serve the business purposes instead of what has often been the case. IT is kind of seen as that place where you're just spending some costs on some technology and everything's lagging behind, right? I think this is a huge year for IT to push forward. And I think some companies will succeed, some will fail, but if you focus on the business, I think that's going to be huge.
Awesome. So it's a big prove it or lose it year for IT when it comes to budget. If they can make it work, they will get the money next year too. But
yeah, no promises. That's not an AppNeta guarantee, just by the way.
The AppNeta guarantee. Love it.
No.
All right. Well, thanks again, Seth and Alec. And thank you, listeners, for joining us on Stories from the Wire, the AppNeta podcast. Subscribe to our feed to get the latest tips and tricks every week on how to manage network performance for the future of work.